We all know that it was in the 6th century BC that cities emerged in the northern plains. We know about the names of these ancient cities as well. But when it comes to the question of what kind of settlement patterns which we see in these regions and how these cities interacted with other settlements that were present in the vicinity, there is not much discussion. So in this video, we will look at the example of Kaushambi, and by looking at the example of ancient Kaushambi, we will try to answer these questions. Now about Kaushambi, we all know that it was in the Mahajanpad period that Kaushambi was the capital of the Mahajanpad of Vats. But the history of Kaushambi is older than the Mahajanpad period. For example, Kaushambi is mentioned in the later Vedic texts like Shatpath Brahmana, Gopath Brahmana and Aitreyi Brahmana. Then in both the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, Kaushambi is mentioned. In the Mahabharata tradition, we are told that after the Great War, the capital of the Kurus was shifted from Hastinapur to Kaushambi. And in the period of the Buddha, in the Buddhist literature, there are 6 Mahanagaras or great cities that are mentioned. And Kaushambi was part of these 6 cities. So we can see how important Kaushambi was in the ancient period. Now when we look at the Kaushambi or the ruins of this ancient city, we find that at present the ruins of this ancient city is located some 50 kilometers southwest of the city of Prague. And it was Alexander Coningham who first identified these ruins with the ancient city of Kaushambi. The first excavation here was carried out between the period 1937 to 1938. And after this period, for 40 years, there were regular excavations that were carried out. So because of these extensive excavations, we have a great deal of information about how Kaushambi evolved and what kind of settlement patterns we see in the vicinity of Kaushambi. Now, if we look at the city of Kaushambi, we find that the earliest phase of Kaushambi is dated to around the first millennium BC. But it was in the period 550 BC to 440 BC, we see that the city of Kaushambi expanded considerably. At this time, the size of Kaushambi was around 200 hectares. The size of 1 hectare is roughly the size of a football field. So we can imagine how immense the size of Kaushambi was at this period. Now the excavation which were carried out here, from these excavation we find that the city of Kaushambi was not alone. There was a hierarchy of settlements where we can see that Kaushambi was at the top with a size of 200 hectares. Now at this time, that is the period of 550 BC to 440 BC, we see that the city of Kaushambi was fortified and the rampart wall had an average height of around 35 feet. And we find that the towers in this fortification had an average height of more than 70 feet, and the length of the total fortification was more than 6 kilometers. So we can imagine how immense this fortification of Kaushambi was. Now, when this fortification happened, there is no agreement. For example, there are some scholars who argue that these fortifications were first constructed around the period of 7th century BC. Now, and some scholars believe that these fortifications were constructed after this period. So the period would be around 6th century BC. So whatever the case may be, we find that it was in the period 550 BC to 440 BC, the city of Kaushambi is at the top of the hierarchies of settlements and it had an average area of around 200 hectares. Now below Kaushambi, there were 2 cities. These 2 were at present situated in Kara and Shringaverpur. We can describe these 2 settlements as secondary centers. Both were situated on the banks of Ganga and the size of both of these settlements was around 12 hectares. These two settlements were also fortified. So we can think of these two settlements as towns. Then after these towns, we have two smaller settlements, both of which had a size of 6 hectares. These were probably minor centers, and from here we have found evidence of manufacturing of ceramics, iron smelting, etc. Below these smaller market centers, there were smaller sites whose size ranged from half hectare to 6.75 hectares. In this period, there were around 17 such sites that have been identified through excavations, and these were probably agricultural villages that practiced agriculture and herding. So here we can see that there is a hierarchy of settlements. At the bottom we have villages, and above villages we have market centers where small manufacturing was done, and above these market centers we have secondary centers or town. These were situated at Kara and Shringaverpur. Here what we find is that precious metals and other precious items were manufactured, and at the top we have Kaushambi, which was also a manufacturing center, but apart from manufacturing center, it was also the political center of the whole region. So this was a hierarchy of settlement which we can see in this period. Now if you look at this map carefully, you will notice that all of these settlements from the top to the bottom are located along the water course. This pattern was not unique to this region. There were other cities and other settlements that were also located along the water course. Now, after this period, that is the period between 440 BC to 100 BC, we find that there is a significant change which we can see in the region of Kaushambi. For example, if we talk about the secondary centers, we find that at the previous period, that is the period between 550 BC to 440 BC, there were two secondary centers at Kara and Shringaverpur. But now during this period, we find that these two secondary centers are there, but there are also two more secondary centers or towns that have come up. These two towns are located at Bhita and Jhusi. These two new settlements were also fortified, and the size of Bhita during this time was around 19 hectares and the size of Jhusi was around 30 hectares. Through the excavation of Bhita, we find that the role of these secondary centers or towns has also changed in this period. So for example, earlier these towns produced products for the main capital, which was Kaushambi. But during this time, we find that there was long distance trade that were happening, and these towns were engaged in these long distance trade. We can say this because from Bhita we have found coins that belonged to other regions, which suggest that there was long distance trade which was happening, and Bhita was taking part in these long distance trade. Another important change which we see in this period is that compared to the previous period, during this period the number of village settlements has increased considerably in this period. This increase in the number of village settlements suggests that the population of this region was increasing. This increase also led to the emergence of an entirely new type of settlement category. These new settlements were found in the midst of rural habitations, and their size was between 3 to 5 hectares. Most probably, these new type of sites functioned as administrative centers, much like the district of our own time. Now, another significant change which we can see during this period is how the different sites are located. So if you look at the map of this period, you will find that some of these new villages are no longer situated along the water course. Some are located in the hinterland. It is generally argued that these settlements were probably situated near lakes. This movement away from the banks and towards the hinterland was most likely facilitated by the large-scale use of iron implements that allowed the clearance of forest and cultivation of the clayey alluvial soil of the Doab region. This movement away from the riverbanks and towards the hinterland will continue in the next period also, that is the period of 100 BC to 300 AD. And we will find that by this time, 1/3 of the total village settlements will be situated in the hinterland. So we can see how these patterns of settlements are evolving. Now, what was happening in the Kaushambi region is not unique to this region alone. We find that, for example, in the Ahichhatra region, which was the capital of Panchal Janpad, something similar was happening. But because of the extensive excavation that were carried out in the Kaushambi region, we have a great deal of information about Kaushambi. Now, one question which you might have is that in these archaeological excavation we are finding different settlements. Now, something similar can also be seen in the literary sources or not. So if we look at the literary sources of this period, we find that there are different types of settlements that are mentioned. So at the bottom we have the gram or gam. Gam is in Prakrit. So here what we find is that these terms are used for villages. Then after this we have Pura, Nigam and Nagar. The definition of these three terms was not strict. So if we take the example of Nigam, we find that in some cases it is used for a ward that is located in the city, and in some cases it is used for a large village, and in some it is used for a market town. The story for the term Pura is also something similar. In the earlier case, Pura was used for a fortified settlement, but during this period it is merged with the term Nagar. So we can see that there was no strict definition for these three terms. Now after this we have a term called Mahanagar, which appears in Buddhist literature. There were 6 Mahanagars in the Buddhist literature. So these are some of the terms that are used in the literary sources for the different kinds of settlement. And if we look at the whole picture from the archaeological as well as literary sources, we find that at this time city was not a single entity. So we can think of the ancient city as a system in which there was a hierarchy of settlement. Now the city was situated at the heart and it was the political center of a particular region. But there were other settlements that provided raw materials and also sometimes finished good to the city. So this was the picture which we find in the ancient times when it comes to how a particular city functioned. Thank you for watching.